But what I suppose fascinated me from Saturday, where we had the Cooperative Party meeting, the public meeting, which was to enhance the conversation about cooperative values.
Yes, yes.
And what you were able to do was to bring in ideas from your two books, and the most recent one about neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And what I think quite a number of people in the audience were interested in was, if you like, almost your backstory of
Yes.
some of the influences on you. Like you just mentioned your parents,
Yes.
maybe the first place you worked. But
Yeah.
I think it's just that, Bryn. It's just, if you could just say a little bit. Yeah.
Okay then. Yeah. So, well, I was born and brought up in Tipton, in the Black Country, which was a complete contrast to my later life in London and then Bath. Tipton at that time was heavily industrial. It was, as I used to tell people, basically two types of dwelling, two types of edifice. There were the council estates and the factories, and people went from one to the other, and occasionally popped off at the pubs in between. And this was in the heyday of manufacturing, so you can imagine the soot, the grime, etc., etc., the foundry dust swirling in the streets. What we used to call swarf, which is metal shavings on the roads that gave all many cars punctures. And my parents, big influence on me. My mother was a Methodist and a very gentle and caring person. And I think it's from her that I first intuitively picked up the idea of equality. She treated everyone exactly the same, whatever their class, their ethnicity or whatever. And from my father, I think I got a disrespect for authority. He would never accept the orthodox version of what was going on. He was he could be cantankerous. But unfortunately, he lost his first wife during the war, and he lost members of his family, and he himself lost both his legs. And this was a real tragedy because it was, in fact, his wedding day. So they had the wedding ceremony, and as was the typical then, they adjourned to a pub to have what we would call the reception, when during the course of the evening a random shell from an anti-aircraft battery a few miles away hit the room. As I say, he and his sister lost their legs. He lost his wife, who was killed. Several other relatives were killed. And so he had to live with that, but he never let it overtly never let it influence him. And he never let the fact that he was limbless, he had bother him. He had artificial limbs, and he insisted on fighting and always pushing on and being treated equally. So you see again. But as I say, he was very disrespectful of authority, which he always said held him back in his later life. He was originally a moulder. He worked in the foundries, but after he lost his legs, he had to learn. He'd left school at 14, so he had to he had to learn to read and write. And eventually he got a job after a couple of different experiences. He got a job in the civil service as a clerk, but he always claimed that he never got on in that because he wouldn't respect authority. He wouldn't kowtow and touch the forelock and so on. And in fact, these influences were very formative. My mother's humility and treatment of everybody, equality. My father's irreverence. And my mother put me through Sunday school, Methodist Sunday school, and you know the old saying that, for example, the Labour Party owes as much to Methodism as it does to Marxism. Well, I think that's probably true in my case. Bible classes and so on and so forth. Respect for the text. Unfortunately, as we did in the 60s, I kicked over the traces a bit, and in my adolescence I refused to go along with it. I became an atheist, which I still am, although I respect Christian and still try to apply Christian values. And I left school with 4 O-levels, big disappointment to everyone. And my father was having none of this. I wasn't going to loaf around. I was going to have to get a job. So he asked around, and he managed to get me an interview at what was called the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance, which soon under Harold Wilson's government became the Department of Social Security. And so I started off in a temporary job writing gyros, what we used to call gyros, or postal drafts, benefit payments. And it was that, paradoxically, it was that job that gave me a lot of my founding beliefs and my concerns about equality, because I graduated eventually to higher level jobs within the social security, and I ended up visiting people to check on their benefits situation. I ended up visiting employers to check that they were paying their national insurance contributions. And so I saw, on the one hand, people in very dire circumstances, people living in appalling living conditions, housing conditions, and at the same time fairly rich individuals employing people but refusing to pay the stamp, as we used to call it, their national insurance. So, you know, people talk about the University of Life. I attended the university. That was my first sociology course in that job. And then I fell in with a group of people who, a bit younger than me, but they were going on to university and they were taking sociology courses. And so I said, oh, what's all this about? And this just happened to, by now we're into the late middle 60s, and it coincided with the upsurge of radicalism, student rebellions, the whole counterculture thing. And I moved into that, and then with the encouragement of some of these friends, I took some A-levels, part evening classes. So I studied while still working and got a job. Sorry, not a job. I got accepted at the London School of Economics, LSE. And I went there for 2 reasons. One, because I had radical traditions amongst students, and secondly, because I knew it was one of the top social science institutions. And so participated a little bit in student politics, honing my views, fell in love with Marxism then, became a sort of, not a Trotskyist, but a theoretical Marxist, and started to appreciate the flow of history and the way that ideas can change things. So I was never a sort of orthodox fundamentalist Marxist, but looking back now I can see that another of my influences, the sociologist called Max Weber, who agreed with Marx. He said, yes, history does follow certain predetermined tracks, but at crucial points someone pulls the lever and changes the tracks, and it's ideas, he called them the switchmen of history. And so I subscribed to that, came to subscribe to that eventually after wrestling with all these big ideas, and got involved with eventually the fringes of the Labour Party, the campaign for Labour Party democracy as it was then. But then I went off to Liverpool, did a PhD, or started a PhD, which I didn't finish till much later. And that was another interesting experience. So involved on the fringes of Liverpool politics, which were rough and ready, but vital and passionate. And then, just to get a job, I came to Bath. So I arrived in Bath 40 years ago, and it was not a very nice day, and the university at that time wasn't very pleasant aesthetically. It was just concrete blocks, and it was cold and windy, and I thought to myself, I'm only going to stay here for about, well, the job was for 12, it was a temporary job. I'm only going to stay here for 12 months, and then I'm off. So we make history, but not as we choose.
No, that's great.
So still here 40 years on, and I wouldn't regard myself as a successful academic. I think I'm in the Championship rather than the Premier League. That's how I regard myself. But again, don't defer to authority or superiority or elitism. Sometimes some of the best players are in the Championship and not in the Premier League. Only sometimes. And really, some of those influences have kept me going and influenced me. So one of the problems I had as an academic, and I think, Jack, you probably had similar experiences, is academics aren't very good at flexibility. Increasingly, they like to follow the rules, and they in my opinion, they overvalue the prestige of certain types of activity. And so I didn't always fit in well as an academic. I got into lots of trouble for champion students who the rest of the department thought were write-offs. I got in trouble for trying to continue the values of the 60s as I saw them, of equality, of free speech, and so on. And so, a bit like my father, who rebelled in a much different environment. I think I've in a different sense, at a different level, I've followed his trajectory.
Could I just take what you said about the transformative power of ideas in relation to Max Weber? Because what you did for me on Saturday, you brought in what for me was an original idea, which I'm really fascinated by, because it seems to me to have shifted how I can now think about transcending neoliberalism. And I just want to check that I've understood, because the power of the idea for me was that in relation to the corporate sector, the corporations, what I think you're advocating was that the small shareholders could actually bring in the values that we were focusing on Saturday, and I know there are wider values, but the International Cooperative Alliance has got a wonderful set of values that, if I've understood, it was that by mobilising small shareholders, was that correct? That in terms of the appointments or who they could elect, that it would be quite a slow process, but it would be transformatory. And that was for me an original idea, which I found for me is transformatory.
Yes, no, I think you pretty much got it. As I said on Saturday, the values in civil society, and especially in the elements of it that Habermas calls the life world, families, communities and so on, they are present in some of these NGOs and civil society organisations. They get squeezed out the bigger the organisation gets, of course. But it seems to me that they are still present, some of those values. Values about transparency, accountability, respect for the environment, respect for one another and so on. And the idea seems to be that by acting as small shareholders, which anybody can do, they can build up shareholdings and small shareholdings in key companies. And if we had those institutional arrangements that I mentioned, like the Swedish nomination committees, then we could gradually, over time, start to change the culture of corporations. And I think there's some sympathy for this, because there is an organisation called Share Action, which, and it's covered in the book, which represents small shareholders' interests. It's not a political type of organisation. It isn't radical anyway, in any way. It isn't really egalitarian. But it does also, it says, in effect, it's saying the little people count. And the big people should be accountable. And anybody should be able to participate if they're a shareholder.
Yeah, so if I could come back to